Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be talking to Jesse Jenkins, who's an assistant professor at Princeton. He tries to keep track of how carbon is produced by energy, how to stop doing that, and what policies and decisions could be made that would, and what those decisions would result in. Is that a good sort of summary of a lot of what you spend your time doing?
Yeah, that's a good, pretty good summary. We try to take assessments and do research on what the very broad scale sweep of our energy system looks like, and how we can change the way we make and use energy to reduce pollution and carbon dioxide and other climate warming greenhouse gases.
I mean, what happens to me is I think to myself, I wonder what it would be like if we switched to all geothermal, or like, what if we're going to have all this extra electricity from peak times for solar and wind because they're getting cheaper and cheaper. And I say, probably we'll use it to lift heavy blocks and then lower them back down to produce energy. And you say, well, let's actually do some math. Let's sit down for a moment and actually figure out what would be the best of those things to do. And that also makes you very helpful, and your lab at Princeton very helpful when it comes time to say, all right, we've got this $370 billion we're going to try and spend to help the crisis that we are in and headed further into. What's that actually going to do?
Yeah, that's right. And this is an interesting bill because it is pretty broad, right? The Inflation
Yes.
Reduction Act, as it became called, contains dozens of individual policies that all are trying to push on our energy system to accelerate the transition to clean energy. And so our challenge was to figure out how to represent the impact of those policies in our modeling of energy systems, and then use that to estimate the aggregate impact, as well as the impact on specific sectors, like how fast are we going to transition to electric vehicles, or how much wind or solar will this help us deploy over the next decade, and in total, what does that do to our greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, employment, things like that we all care about.
That seems like it would be very hard. Obviously, it is. It requires like predicting the future. How fast are we going to switch over to electric vehicles is going to be impacted by the price of gasoline, which no one can predict. It's going to be impacted by the availability of a lot of different elements that are very in demand right now. Is that just sort of a look at as much data as you can and come to the conclusion you come to kind of thing?
Yeah, especially given that we're trying to rapidly evaluate these policies, like in as close to real time as
The
possible. I
problem
mean,
is like it's like
yeah,
Chuck Schumer shows up and he's like, "All right, we're gonna pass this in a week," and you're like, "Oh,
yeah.
well,
I
what did
mean,
we
quite
prepare
literally,
the
that's
model?"
we deliberately set ourselves out that difficult task with what we call the Repeat project, which stands for Rapid Energy Policy Evaluation and Analysis Toolkit.
Okay, great.
So we got the
And
rapid part in there. We got
I
the repeated
assume,
part in there.
yeah, I assume that that's a
Yeah.
really ugly piece of graphical user interface that you do a lot of data entry into and push buttons on. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of spreadsheets involved. At Princeton, we did a report that came out in right at the beginning of this Congress, called Net Zero America, which was a really comprehensive effort to look at different possible pathways that we could take to get to the point of net zero emissions, which is where we stop really digging a deeper hole for ourselves. That's the point where we're no longer emitting
Right.
any more greenhouse gases than we're taking out of the atmosphere every year due to human activities. Until we get there, we're still digging a deeper hole. We're still adding CO2 to the atmosphere,
We're just
and
digging
so
it
that's our
less
ultimate goal.
quickly as we were before. So we are
Exactly.
down, I don't know, what is it, 20 something percent from peak already. We're gonna, with this bill, we're gonna take it down over the next 10 years, hopefully more than this with other actions, but with just this bill, down to around 40% from peak. But then there's that other 60%, and it gets
Yeah.
harder as you get down there because there's some stuff that's just harder to turn off. Like, it's a lot easier to replace the power that's generated in the middle of the day when the sun is out than it is in the depths of the winter here in Montana.
It's true that the challenges shift, and in some cases they seem harder. On the other hand, over time we get much better at doing this stuff, and so I'm actually confident that with the
Yeah.
kind of support that we've set in place, with both the infrastructure law that passed last year, which has a lot of investments in demonstration and early deployment of a bunch of technologies that we need to get a lot better between now and 2030, and the support in the infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is going to accelerate and supercharge the deployment rates for some of these technologies, that we are going to drive down their costs and improve the performance of a bunch of technologies in ways that make it much easier down the line to tackle some of those problems that today look hard. And the reason I'm confident about that is like we go back to the last time Congress tried to pass a climate bill
I
and
remember.
failed, which was 2009. I
Uh-huh.
can't believe it took us 13 years to get
Yeah.
back to this point, which is
That was
terrible.
my
But
beat back then. That's what I did all the
yeah,
time.
I was there too. That was my I was a much younger and slightly less gray haired, but
Yeah.
yeah, I was there as well and lived through that experience. And at the time, uh, if you could get a wind or solar project, a wind farm that costs less than $100 a megawatt hour, which is like triple the normal electricity rate, that was a great deal.
Yeah.
And solar was 10 times the cost of normal power from a gas plant or something.
Yeah.
But over the last decade, due to supportive policies in the U.S. but also abroad in China and Germany and Japan and elsewhere, we've deployed a ton of wind and solar projects, and we've driven down the cost of solar by to 1/10 of what it was in 2009, and so wind to about 2/3 by about 2/3 from where it was then. And so we've taken these what we used to call expensive alternative energy technologies that at the time people were worried we couldn't get 5 or 10 or 15% of our electricity from without blowing up the grid.
Right.
And now they're cheap trillion-dollar mainstream technologies that are
Yeah.
scaling rapidly and are powering in the case of some parts of the country the majority of our electricity on certain days. And so that's the kind of technological change, the kind of learning by doing, economies of scale, and improvements in technology that the kinds of bills that we just passed are going to supercharge for wind and solar, as well as a range of other more nascent technologies that are more where wind and solar were in 2009.
Yeah, it's so easy to forget. Like oftentimes we sort of talk about Moore's law as if it's just a law of the universe, but
Right.
it's not like Moore's law isn't a thing that happens without there being a lot of incentive to make it happen. People working very hard, trying lots of different things that might work, and some of them end up working, and many of them don't. And then you plot it on a graph and you're like, oh, look, it seems inevitable. That's not how this works. Like wind and solar are cheaper now because we made those early investments. Wind and solar are cheaper now because people worked really hard to try and find ways to make them cheaper and more efficient. And I'm super excited about the things that these more nascent technologies, as you say. I think that there's a number of them in here. I'm curious if you have any favorites.
Yeah, I mean, so the big ones that we really need to kind of step up from now and get ready for prime time by, say, 2030 or 2032 are advanced nuclear and advanced geothermal and other what I call firm clean power technologies, the technologies that are really there whenever you need them and as
Right.
long as you need them.
You can just turn.
That doesn't mean all the time, because there are times you don't need them. So we don't want 24/7 continuous power, actually. We want power that you can call up when you need it. And we're reliant today on fossil fuel power plants and our existing nuclear fleet for that. But over time, we have to replace those plants with something else. And we can get a lot of energy from wind and solar, but I like to call them reliably unreliable, right? Like we know not to count on them when you absolutely need it.
Yeah.
And so we also need something that can complement them. Some amount of energy storage, which is good at shifting things around within the daytime, 24-hour kind of cycles. And then also these firm generation technologies that are all, more expensive than wind and solar, less mature, but we're going to need them at scale. And this bill really helps push a lot of those forward, as well as the infrastructure law.
Yeah.
The other ones are, ways to decarbonize industry. Electricity and transportation are our two biggest sources of emissions, but we actually have a lot of tools, clean electricity, electric vehicles, efficient, hybrid cars to drive down emissions in those sectors. The industrial sectors are the next highest, and it's about a fifth of our emissions. And so that's a big chunk that we have to take on. And we have less tools in the toolbox there. And so there are things like carbon capture that can help take big point sources of CO2 emissions and take the CO2 out of the smokestack and throw it underground back where it came from and store it there, indefinitely. There's industrial electrification, right? We can shift from burning fossil fuels to produce steam or process heat and shift to electricity, sometimes used intermittently from cheap wind and solar, and then either paired with a natural gas boiler where you just sort of switch back and forth, or increasingly with energy storage. There's a lot of really exciting thermal energy storage companies that are thinking, all right, I'm going to have a big brick of ceramics that I heat up whenever the wind and solar is there and it gets really hot, and then I just draw heat continuously off of it to power my food processing factory or whatever else needs process heat on a 24/7 basis.
Right.
And then there's hydrogen and other clean fuels that we need both for industry and for transportation that can't easily electrify, like synthetic jet fuel, or maybe some long distance trucking that is going to need hydrogen or other fuels to go the long haul.
Trucking is always such an interesting one to be because it seems like pairing like an electric truck with a driverless truck is bad because what you're going to want out of long distance trucking is, if you don't have to have a driver, is for it to go all the time and never stop. And that is much easier to do with a liquid fuel than it is with a battery.
That's
At
true.
least
Although,
like I don't know where we're at with energy densities, but
it is true, although we're getting faster and faster charge times for
yeah.
batteries. And so, the challenge there is that it's a huge electric draw. Like a semi truck rolls up to a fast charger station,
Uh-huh.
plugs in, and it's like an entire subdevelopment of, homes
Yeah.
instantly pops on the grid. And so you're not going to
Yeah.
be able to do that without having another battery, some capacitor bank or battery that's sitting there ready to discharge into it. So it'll trickle charge and then throw that power into into the vehicle or something. So there's costs there, but the
Yeah.
technology is getting better and cheaper. And it may be that actually, I mean, over time, we used to, like, if you went back again 10 years ago, I think there was, universal consensus amongst very serious people that hydrogen was the way to go for long distance transportation. But if you look at where we are now with the declining cost of batteries, which also, by the way, fell by a factor by 90%. So they're, a factor of 10 reduction over the last decade. Actually, electric trucking makes a lot of sense in a lot of applications, and more as we go. And so I used to be skeptical that you could do long haul on batteries, but I'm more optimistic that either battery or battery hybrid systems might actually be able to go the distance there, and are going to go into more and more applications. But
Yeah.
certainly for things like fleet deliveries, sure, like UPS and Amazon and all those
Oh yeah, and
vehicles that
even
are
a
out
lot
there.
of trucking is not as far as you might imagine. Like a
No,
lot of
all of the
trucking is pretty
medium,
local.
yeah, and dry edge trucking at ports, right? We're taking things off of trucks and getting them onto rail and things like that. That's going to electrify, I think, a lot faster than we think. And actually, this bill, I mean, we haven't got into the details of the bill yet, but one of the things it does that I think is underappreciated, there's a lot of public reporting about the kind of consumer-facing electric vehicle incentives. But there's also a 30% tax credit for businesses to electrify or turn to fuel cell vehicles. And that's up to $40,000 for a medium or heavy duty vehicle. So all of those UPS delivery trucks and those port dryage, and short haul trucks, that's enough to cover all of the cost premium right now of buying an electric truck. And then it costs you about half as much to operate and maintain once you get it. And businesses are much more cost conscious than consumers. And so I think we're going to see the private sector respond very quickly to these kinds of incentives.
So speaking of incentives and how quickly we can respond to them, one of the things that's going to like sort of be available January 1st is some like electric vehicle rebates. But what doesn't seem like it's going to be available is the electric vehicles. Both in terms of like it's not like we're having a hard time selling them right now anyway, and also in terms of there are some qualifications that electric vehicles have to hit in order for them to be what to qualify for those rebates.
And maybe before we dive right into the weeds on that one, I'll sort of sketch out at the high level what the bill does. The Inflation Reduction Act, it's funny to think like this is the climate bill. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act. Well, why is that? It's actually not just in the name. It's the fact that this bill from the very beginning, even when it was part of the much broader Build Back Better Act that the House passed in the fall, with a bunch of other social policies and things like that in it, was designed around making clean energy cheaper, which is a big departure from what we've tried to do in the past with regulations or carbon pricing, which is designed to make fossil fuels either more expensive or to restrict our use of fossil fuels and then shift us on to clean energy.
Yeah.
So this bill is designed to make clean energy cheap, and it does that immediately through subsidies, tax credits, rebates, loans, loan guarantees that make it financially just good business sense for individuals to buy an electric car or a heat pump instead of a fossil fuel car or boiler, for businesses to do the same kind of thing, and for utilities to turn to clean electricity instead of dirty fossil power generation. And that's just the kind of subsidized effect of the bill. But then, of course, it also drives down the cost of these technologies over time, as we talked about before, by driving competition and scale up and economies of scale and incremental innovation that only happens when you have a real demand for your product, that will drive down the real cost of these technologies over time as well. And so when you take all that together, you have a bill that drives down global greenhouse gas emissions in the United States by what we estimate is on the order of an additional 1 billion tons per year. in 2030. That does about 2/3 of the work that we need to do to get to our goal of cutting emissions to 50% of our peak levels by 2030. So it doesn't get us all the way there on its own, but it does about 2/3 of that work.
Mm-hmm.
And it drives down energy costs for consumers, which is why Joe Manchin could credibly rebrand this and resurrect the bill as the Inflation Reduction Act. It drives down costs in three ways. It makes electricity and other fuels cheaper by subsidizing them, right? Subsidizing cleaner, cheaper alternatives. So that lowers electricity cost. Resources for the Future estimates by on the order of $100 to $200 per household per year on average. It also is going to lower oil and gas consumption significantly in the United States, because we're going to turn off of, we're going to turn to electric vehicles and get off of boilers and get off of gas-fired power plants. We estimate that that'll cut oil consumption by about 13% and gas consumption by about 8%. And then that drives down global oil and gas prices. Again, our estimate is about 5% reduction in global oil prices and about a 10 to 20% reduction in North American gas prices. It's not a global market per se, so bigger impact there.
And this is important.
And that lowers costs for people as well.
Yeah, so that lowers costs for people, but it also lowers profit for oil companies, so they are less interested in doing new oil and gas development.
Yes,
which
is important because the bill also opens some lands for oil and gas development, but there's no guarantee anybody actually wants that land.
Right, because it's expensive to develop this stuff, and also the cheapest stuff to get out of the ground has already been gotten out of the ground. If we can get that price lower, there's no incentive to actually pump the stuff.
Exactly. And there's also long-term, if you lease a project today, you lease a piece of land, from a federal auction or from private sector leases today, it might be 6 or 7 years before that actually starts producing. So now you're talking about 2029 or 2030 or 2020, and then that project has to make financial sense for the next decade or two. So already before this bill passed, you had BP and Shell and other big oil companies projecting a global peak in oil demand around 2030. That's before the crisis, the energy crisis that's driven Europe away from fossil fuels at a much faster pace to get away from Russian fossil energy dependence, given the soaring costs there, and before this bill helps drive down U.S. consumption as well. So if you're an oil company updating your long-term outlook, it doesn't look so great after the passage of this bill and what Europe's doing. And so I do think we're going to see a lot less interest in development, not none, because there still is demand for oil and gas. The U.S. may ultimately become a much bigger exporter as we reduce our own consumption, which would be a big reversal from our historic role as the world's biggest importer 10 years ago. But it will overall mean lower oil prices globally, lower gas prices in North America, and that's going to put downward pressure on incentives to develop new land. There is one other way in which, and gets back to your original question about EVs, that it does lower costs for households too. So it's going to lower electricity costs. It's going to lower eventually global oil and gas prices. That's going to get bigger effect over time. Most immediately, it's going to lower the upfront cost for individuals and businesses to purchase things like electric cars or heat pumps or energy efficient upgrades to their homes or businesses that cost more upfront, but then lower your energy costs over time. And the bill is going to take, generally roughly 30% of that upfront cost right off the top. And it's going to put it onto the federal tax code, specifically in this bill onto big corporations that haven't been paying more than 15% taxes, and to tax cheats that the IRS is going to go after with more money. So that's a pretty good deal for the average household, right? You get a cheaper electric car or heat pump, and some tax cheat pays the bill for you.
Yeah, I mean, I run two businesses that pay that we haven't figured out how to do all these fancy things to not pay taxes, and so it's very frustrating when I look at how much the tax rate that Apple pays versus the tax rate that I, as a company, and I'm like, boy, it would be a lot easier to run this business if I paid the same tax rate as like a giant corporation. So it is cool to.
So you should install some energy efficient appliances, get those tax cuts, and then shift the cost onto Apple.
Yes, 100%. I'm looking forward to my heat pump. So we've got all that.
So back to EVs.
But there's also there is an industrial policy part of this. It also is, we want these things to be made in America. We want them to be made by union labor. We want the components that go into them. We want that to be ours, so that that's like a security thing. And it's also sort of just a, we want, maybe we realize that there are some drawbacks to this globalization thing that we did, and maybe we want to do a little bit less of it. And I think so can you walk me through so I think there's two components of what makes the EV break work, like
Yeah,
to
that's right. And
qualify
so
for it.
both for EVs and for clean electricity, like wind and solar,
Okay.
and advanced nuclear, we have the bill contains both incentives for adoption that are tied to domestic content,
Mm-hmm.
or at least get bonuses, get bigger if you buy domestic content.
Yep.
And it includes a bunch of production subsidies for manufacturers to lower the cost of producing in the United States. So it's working on both the supply and the demand side. Really,
Mm-hmm.
for the first time, we've ever had an industrial policy like this in the
Yeah.
energy sector.
Yeah.
You combine that with the CHIPS bill, which just got signed into law, which does the same thing for semiconductors.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, the US has a strategic industrial policy for the first time since the Cold War. And so
Does
this is
this
really,
seem cheap to you? Like I look at the numbers and I'm like, that's expensive, but not that expensive.
no.
Like,
Yeah, I mean, it isn't. I mean, chips is, you're going to spend 50 something billion on semiconductors. This spends something like 60 billion on clean energy manufacturing. But the amount of jobs and
yeah,
security and potential cost reductions for things like cars and clean electricity that drives is definitely worth the investment. And other countries have been doing this for years, right? So
yeah.
it's not like, it's just like we've been fighting, the global competition with one hand behind our back, and all of a sudden
Mm-hmm.
we're like, oh, no, maybe we should do this, right? And so the way that works for EVs is, and this is the one that's going to be the most challenging to meet right away,
Yep.
is it says
I'm
that
sorry to give
basically,
you the hardest one, but cars are
no,
hard.
it's fine. It's good to break it down. So right now there's a $7,500 tax credit for EVs, except that for each manufacturer, there's a 200,000 vehicle cap. So once they've sold more than 200,000 plug-in or electric cars, the tax credit goes away. And so like Tesla blew through that a long time ago.
Yep.
GM is through that. Ford and Toyota are racing up against that soon. And so if you kind of go forward 2 years from now, basically no one would have a EV credit except for maybe some bespoke luxury car manufacturers, right, that don't sell that many vehicles. And so what the bill does is it says, look, we're going to give a long-term extension to those, actually all the way out to 2032. And we're going to lift that per vehicle manufacturer requirement, but we're going to make you make it in America. And so immediately upon passage of the bill, only vehicles that are assembled in North America qualify for the credit. So that it's going to hurt, Volvo and some others that, that manufacture overseas that haven't gotten to their cap yet. They're going to lose the credit. And that's, a bummer for some people who are planning to buy those vehicles in the next 6 months or so. Do it now, right? Do it soon. And then it also implements a requirement that basically splits the tax credit in half. So there's $3,750 that are tied to two different requirements. One is sourcing the critical minerals that go into the batteries in increasing quantities from North America or free trade agreement countries. So friendly, countries like Australia or Chile that we have free trade agreements with. And then the other half is tied to assembling the battery components or packs in North America as well. And so there's an increasing percentage of that that's required. Now, over time, I think both of those are doable to meet. Already, we're seeing over $180 billion by automakers in U.S. supply chains for producing electric vehicles and batteries. That's before this bill. So we're going to have a flood of investment coming into the U.S.
Right.
to build these supply chains out to meet the skyrocketing demand from consumers. On the other hand, there is a provision in the bill that is specifically geared towards getting the U.S. supply chain away from China, very specifically focused on China and Russia, to be fair. But there's a provision in the bill that says as of 2024, not any content. So not only do you have to meet the domestic content or North American or free trade content requirements, but as of 2024, no content in your battery can come from a entity of foreign concern, which is effectively China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, countries like that. But mostly China, which is the important one in the battery supply chain.
Yeah.
And then as of 2025, none of the materials content can come from China either. And that's actually the kicker, because right now, something like 90% of the lithium processing, not necessarily the raw lithium, which comes from all over, but the lithium processing into the materials we need to build cathodes and anodes for batteries, that is done in China. And so this is going to have to shift the whole supply chain away from that. And I do think that's going to take some time.
Yeah, it does seem like good to not have one country in charge of 90% of the
90% of a global important strategic commodity. Yeah. Especially a potential strategic adversary of the United States. Is not as much as I hate the saber rattling that's going on, right now between the US and China. But, again, that's the demand pull side. So that's saying, look, if you want these credits, you want your vehicles to get cheaper, automakers change your supply chain. But then they could have just left it at that. That's a typical approach. But the bill also contains a huge set of incentives and loans and grants to help automakers actually meet that requirement. So there is a new production tax credit for critical minerals processing or recycling that's worth 10% of the cost of the product.
Right.
There's a battery assembly and battery module and or cell and pack assembly tax credit that's also worth almost 30% of the cost of a battery pack today.
Wow.
And there is $30 billion in loans from DOE and $2 billion in grants to help retool automaking facilities in the U.S. So that's really going to help drive a lot of investment in response to these incentives. So my guess is 2023, 2024, 2025, there'll be very few models that qualify for these requirements. But over time, there'll be more and more, and that'll mean more and more jobs in the United States and more minerals sourced from friendlier or allied countries.
And are those credits for manufacturing? Is that in the like advanced manufacturing?
Exactly, production tax credit. It also supports, by the way, manufacturing of wind and solar components in the United States as well at kind of similar levels.
Yeah, and like grid storage, I think.
And yeah, well, so the battery manufacturing is any kind of battery, so it includes grid storage. And then on the electricity side, it's not quite so draconian of a requirement as the EVs, but there is a bonus incentive worth 10% more for the tax credits for wind and solar and nuclear and other clean electricity sources if you source all of the steel and aluminum in the U.S. and I think the majority of the manufactured content is manufactured in the value of that content is manufactured in the U.S. And so that's also going to, so I did a study last year with my colleague Aaron Mayfield at Dartmouth College now, where we looked at the incremental cost of manufacturing in the U.S. And if you pay all workers in the solar supply chain 20% more than the median wage, so wages go up, and you source all of the content in the United States, it adds only about 11% to the cost of installing a solar project. So voila, that bonus incentive already covers that additional cost. And that's before you account for the fact that we're going to lower that cost with the subsidies for advanced manufacturing. So it's going to make buying American wind components, solar components, batteries much more attractive than it is today and really help propel a lot of investment in U.S. supply chains and manufacturing jobs all over the country.
And it's not just trying to get stuff made in America. It's also like specifically trying to get stuff made in pretty specific ways sometimes in America. I was going through trying to like look at the bigger line items in the bill, and one of them is subsidies for existing nuclear power plants to just like don't close. We need this firm power. And if y'all close, we're just going to have to start building coal plants again or something. The subsidy on its own was quite small. And then it was like, but if you pay people this much, if you do this much like apprenticeship or union labor, it's just like a lot of different things. Like there were multipliers that end up making it really big.
That's right. And that's consistent throughout all of the electricity related tax credits is that there is sort of a base rate in the bill, which is 20% of the real value of the credit, like the full value of the credit that we expect most people will get. But in order to get the full value, for the first time ever, those tax credits are tied to paying prevailing wages in the local area. And to certain amounts of apprenticeship jobs to create opportunities for new workers to come into the field. And that's going to be real important because these sectors are going to grow enormously. Like we're talking about like 1 million new jobs installing wind and solar over the next decade. So like where are those workers going to come from if they can't get on the job training? And how are we going to attract them if we don't pay them prevailing wages? And one of the challenges has been historically the employment and the wages and compensation and unionization rates in the renewable energy sector have been much lower than in traditional power plants and in fossil fuel, refineries and extraction. And we're hopeful this doesn't require unionization, but it does require paying prevailing wages. And one good way to do that is to, have a union representing your workers. So I think this is likely to lead to broader rates of unionization or to similar increases in wages for folks across these sectors. And that's going to be key to making sure that clean energy jobs are actually good paying, family supporting jobs. That also, there's a bunch of the sort of politics and political theory of this that we can come back to, but like that is not an insignificant point that we're creating manufacturing jobs all over. We're creating good prevailing wage jobs in construction all over the country. There's some things that try to drive investment into communities of the low income and disadvantaged communities and communities that have historically had fossil related employment. To help make sure they deliver, that we deliver real benefits for them as part of the transition. All of that, I think, is not just designed to be fair, but also designed strategically to make everyone have a stake, an economic stake now, not 30 years from now in terms of avoided damages, in this clean energy transition that will make it easier to sustain the politics and the policy support for the long term.
Do you have like a pet thing that you think could be really impactful that we're not paying enough attention to, or that didn't make it into the bill?
That's a good question. I mean, there are some things that we didn't model in our modeling that I mean, the main thing I've been highlighting is the industrial policy stuff, because we don't really directly capture that in the emissions numbers that we're reporting. But I do think, I mean, I've been saying this repeatedly, like in 10 years, when we look back on the importance of this bill, beyond 1 billion tons of emissions reductions or thereabout, I think the thing we're going to credit it with doing is really putting the US back in the global game when it comes to producing and maybe exporting clean energy technologies. And, we were on the cusp of basically ceding all of these markets to foreign competitors. And, fine, we can import cheap stuff from China. That's okay for consumers. But I do think the economic and political cost of that decision would have been really high. And we're coming back from the brink with this bill. We're going to say, no, 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 no. We're going to build these big, industries in the United States and make sure that as we transition away from fossil fuels and conventional internal combustion engine car manufacturing, which are big mainstays of employment and tax bases across much of the country, that we're going to replace that with similarly high quality jobs and with local tax revenues. I do think that's really important to make sure that this is a transition that everybody can benefit from, and we don't see, big blocking coalitions emerge later that say, hey, this is a raw deal for us. I don't want to be part of this anymore, and I want you to stop it. So I think that it's going to be really important. We'll look back in 2030 or 2032 and say, I'm glad we did that.
Yeah.
The other thing, though, I should add is there are some other provisions that we don't model that are kind of tucked in there that now that the bill has passed the Senate, I can talk more about, which is designed to help facilitate retirement and repowering and retooling of coal-fired power plants and other fossil energy infrastructure.
Huh.
So there's
I've read so much and I didn't see anything about this.
Yeah, so there's $9.7 billion in there for the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, which runs the Rural Electric Cooperatives Program, which is a New Deal era provision dating all the way back to the to the 1930s, that helps finance investments in power generation by rural electric cooperatives that helped electrify the rural parts of the country. They now have access to a $9.7 billion fund to help them modify the loans that they have still outstanding on existing coal plants, or to pay for new replacement power from renewable energy or other, to install carbon capture on their existing, fossil power plants, but otherwise transition to cleaner, lower emitting sources. And up to 25% of that is forgivable. So it's, you're going to have some loans and some grants and also some forgivable loans. And I think that's going to really hasten the transition for these rural electric co-ops. And then there's a new loan guarantee program at the Department of Energy that has up to $250 billion in loan authority to similarly help retool, repower, retrofit, and reclaim, it's all ours, which is great, the existing, any kind of existing fossil energy facility, whether that's a power plant or an oil refinery or, a pipeline, things like that. And what that can do is basically help if you say you owe, debt on an existing facility and it's at 4 or 5% interest, the DOE can offer you a much lower rate and help you refinance that loan and save a bunch of money if you're willing to retire it early or transition to a clean resource.
Wow, that's
and
really
so
cool.
Those are subtle things that just shift a lot of capital.
Yeah.
You have to remember, we're already going to spend trillions of dollars on energy infrastructure over the next decade. The question is, what are we going to spend it on? And so it might not look like a lot of money when you think $370 billion of direct expenditure, or at least estimated expenditures under the bill. It's about tweaking things on the margins in ways that make, shift $1 trillion from this to this, right? And so, it's going to have a big impact that I think is underappreciated. So you think 350 billion is not a lot, but if you think about tweaking everything on the margin by enough to make it just make better financial sense, it's going to, catalyze and drive, trillions of dollars of total investment over the next decade and beyond.
It's been frustrating for me a bit to watch as 95% of the bill gets ignored in order to say one or two things that are good things that it does, and then talk about Joe Manchin's pipeline and his oil leases. How worried should we be about Joe Manchin's pipeline and his oil leases?
So if you are thinking about total greenhouse gas emissions, Not very
And
worried.
that's what you do. Like that's like you
That's
put
my
the
perspective.
yeah.
What the bill is doing is it's offering, so it does two things. It specifically approves 4 leases that were previously offered by Trump, the Trump
Hmm.
administration, offshore oil and gas leases. 3 of those are in the Gulf of Mexico, and one is in Alaska. And through executive agency actions under the Biden administration, in one case through a court order, those approvals were remanded and denied.
Hmm.
And this bill basically goes back and overrules that due process and says, no, 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 the legislature is specifically approving these 4 projects. So if I were a local resident worried about oil spills and impacts from those projects or the
Hmm.
pipelines that are going to carry those things on shore, or I'm one of the environmental lawyers that helped previously stop those projects, I would be livid. And that's the one that really pisses me off the most, because it's just a violation of due process and the
Yeah.
separation of powers. And like, these projects already went through this and they were already denied, and then you're
Yeah.
overturning that. So that sucks. Like, there's nothing good about that.
Hmm.
The other provision is that it basically tries to tie the hands of the Biden administration and any future presidents from banning oil and gas sales on public lands and waters entirely. And the way it does that is kind of convoluted, but what it does is it says, if you want to lease any offshore waters for wind development,
Uh-huh.
you have to have also leased a certain acreage, or offered for lease, not necessarily sold, but offered for lease, a certain number of acres of offshore oil and gas sites, or parcels, within the last year. And
Hmm.
similarly for onshore wind and solar siting on public lands like BLM or Forest Service lands, you have to have offered for lease within the last year a certain amount of oil or gas leases.
Yeah.
Now I say offered because you don't necessarily
Hmm.
have to. They don't necessarily have to have been purchased.
Right.
And I think if we look in aggregate at the what this does to the incentives to produce on federal or non-federal lands, as I mentioned before, it's driving oil and gas demand down by a lot. And demand is really the primary thing that's going to drive investment in new production, right? And so if demand is going down in the US, it's going down in Europe, it's peaking globally in the late 2020s. That's going to significantly reduce incentives for production. And the other thing it does, besides just offering these sales up, is it raises royalty rates. This is underreported as well. It actually raises the royalty rates to produce on public lands. And it increases by a factor of 10 the rental rates to take a lease and then not use it. So if the way the current lands work is if you buy a lease, you pay a rental rate until you start producing, and then you pay a percentage of the value of the production. Both of those go way up under the bill. And so I think that also is going to put downward incentive on lease sales, all else equal. And so when we net all that out, we really can't model this very small changes that those lease sales will result in. What will really drive things is the much bigger question about how much demand for U.S. exports of oil and gas there will be, given broader global
Right.
trends and
Hmm.
geopolitics, right? Because there's one thing is macro demand for oil and gas, but we also, of course, have this moment where Russia, which is one of the biggest exporters in the world of oil and gas, is getting taken out of people's supply chains, right? Europe's in
Hmm.
particular. And so the U.S. may play a big role in kind of filling that gap for Europe. And then what that means for U.S. production is still, I think, pretty uncertain. So we tried to bound that in our study. It doesn't have a huge impact on U.S. emissions. It's about plus or minus 2% of the billion tons that we estimated.
Hmm.
But it does lead to some uncertainty about the levels of U.S. production. I don't think any of them will be. I mean, it won't be higher than business as usual. It will certainly be lower than that. But the question is how much lower.
Right. Business as usual, meaning the last 10 years.
Or the world without this policy enacted,
Okay.
right? The world
Gotcha.
we were in 3 weeks ago, and it looked like Joe mentioned it killed the thing before he
Yeah.
resurrected it and then championed it for the last couple of weeks.
So
Yeah.
let's talk about that for a second. I mean, I've been thinking about this in terms of because spend a lot of time thinking about NASA and space, and every once in a while you have one of these missions. I find it very hard to watch a launch of something like Perseverance or the JWST because like so like decades of work embodied in this thing, billions of dollars, and it could just
Yeah.
pop off
Blow
like
up.
a firework. And I think about like that's like the worst possible thing that can happen. But like then I was looking at going through a lot of the work that people have done on this, reading pieces of the bill, reading analysis about and I'm just thinking, this thing felt pretty recently like it wasn't going to happen at all. And I don't know if people sort of internalized that broadly, that like that like this very large, really impactful piece of legislation had been worked on for years and had been based on more years of work by thousands of people. And then it, instead of like everybody like at least feeling bad for you and like everybody sort of like nationally mourning, we were all just going to be a little bit more cynical and jaded, a little bit more um just like frustrated that day, and nobody was going to think about you, nobody was going to think about, you know, the administrator of the EPA, nobody's going to think about these people like this is basically, you know, 36 James Webb Space Telescopes that
Yeah.
that are ultimately going to have a much bigger impact on our future. Not nothing against space telescopes, and also like not just in a avoiding terrible outcomes way, but also in a just like the telescope having cool, interesting things happen way, where you
Yeah.
have, you know, technologies that wouldn't have otherwise existed. Am I sort of capturing that correctly?
So, I mean, that's a good way to put it. So, look, like the last time we tried to pass federal climate policy was 13 years ago.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
there are a lot of us have spent a lot of time kind of rebuilding and
Mm-hmm.
driving and waiting for the moment of opportunity to get a policy package together, thinking about the strategy for that, outlining policies. You know, this bill kind of got assembled from a bunch of those ideas, right? And some of them fell out along the way.
Yeah.
But then, look, we had to pass it through the House of Representatives as the Build Back Better Act, which took, you know, most of last year. It passed in November. That was hard enough, and there was a lot of, you know, agony and challenge and effort that went into
Mm-hmm.
that. And then in December, right after that, was the first time Joe Manchin killed this bill, right?
Mm-hmm.
When he said, "Look, I can't support the Build Back Better Act in its current form. I'm walking away from the table." And so we went through the collective, you know, stages of grief around the bill in December. I remember where I was sitting that day, and I was in shock, and you know, we were stunned at and you know, just feeling the idea that look, we, you know, this decade of effort and this one little window of opportunity that we had to do something big just slammed shut.
Mm-hmm.
But then, as we did again when it happened the second time, we didn't give up because again, this is our only opportunity, right? We could lose, Democrats could lose the, you know, House or Senate very probably in November this year. And so this is the window where you have a chance to pass a bill with, you know, 50 Democrats in the Senate and get it done. And so,
Yeah.
you know, we went back to work, and so did Senate leadership, and so did members of the, you know, Senate staff, and they pushed on, and so did Joe Manchin's staff, you know, internally, and they pushed on him, and they built on personal trust, and they built on arguments, and they built on external validators to pressure, and he came back to the table. And he started working on a stripped down, you know, smaller version of the Build Back Better Act. So instead of the $3.5 trillion bill that passed the House, this was going to be a $1.5 trillion bill. And, you know, roughly half of that was going to go to inflation or to deficit reduction.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot less spending, most of the social programs and, you know, really transformative kind of New Deal era stuff that could have been done in the Build Back Better Act was
Mm-hmm.
cut. And that's really tragic as well. We should take some time to, you know, to mourn that lost
Mm-hmm.
opportunity. But the climate package actually was pretty well maintained. So there was about $500 billion in the House bill, and this final package was about $370 billion. And our estimate is that it retains about 80% of the emissions reduction impact as the House bill. So it's interesting that as the bill went from $5 trillion in Bernie Sanders' mind to $3.5 trillion in the House bill to $1.5 trillion down to ultimately only $700 billion in the final bill, that the climate package was the piece that stayed in there and stayed pretty intact. And that's due to a lot of effort by
Yeah,
a lot of people
I
to
do
say this is
wonder
the thing
about
we
that.
can't afford to lose on.
Yeah. Is it attributable to like that reality that this is kind of the last chance? Like if we lose House or Senate or both,
Yep.
and then, you know, whatever happens in 2024, there's a long time before the next chance.
Yeah, and by that point, it could very well be, you know, way too late to avoid a lot of the damages that we're trying to avoid now. I mean, basically, if we didn't pass this bill, you know, yes, we can make up some of that with EPA action. Yes, we can do some state, local stuff. That's what we've been getting by on for a decade.
Mm-hmm.
But we would have been off the path to net zero by 2050. We would
Oh,
not
sure.
have been on a
Yeah.
path
Yeah.
that's consistent with,
Mm-hmm.
you know, trying to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees average, you know, Celsius average globally. That's the target that the world has set. And we would have just been off the rails
Yeah,
in a bad
and
way.
the world would look at, you know, us, the people who
Yep.
have emitted the majority of the carbon that's currently in the atmosphere. That's different for people listening than how much is being emitted per year, but we've been doing it
But
for
still,
longer
even the
than
number
anyone
two
else.
global emitter, right, behind
Yeah,
China.
yeah.
And they would have said
And
we don't have your act together. We
yeah,
don't trust you.
why would anyone else take the action if we aren't taking the action?
Yep. And then beyond that, there's all of the economic implications we were talking about before. This
Yeah.
was our chance to do industrial policy around
Hmm.
EVs, around solar, around wind, around
Around
batteries,
the
and we would have
the
lost that
big
too.
giant trillions of dollars change that this earth is about to
Yep.
go through. We've never done like an energy switch of this magnitude
No.
aside from the first time we got electricity. Like
Yeah,
that's the,
right.
that was bigger than this.
And we may need
But
to do it about twice as fast this time around, right?
yeah.
As effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then just like, God, it was only 4 weeks ago now, I think. I was on vacation with my family, or leaving for vacation with my family. And for a couple of weeks relaxing on Cape Cod, and I got the call from Senator Schumer's staff that the bill was dead, that
Oh my
Manchin
God.
and Schumer had spoken, and the inflation numbers that came out for June had spooked Joe Manchin, and he was deciding to walk away from the bill because he didn't want to do anything that would add fuel to the fire. And so they were talking about only passing some subsidies for the Affordable Care Act and prescription drug reform, and no climate stuff. Not even a little less, but none, right? And so in the middle of June, this bill was dead. At the end of June, this bill was dead, or in July, I guess it wasn't. Yeah, July. This bill wasn't going to happen, and we again got to sort of stare that abyss of failure in the face as a collective community. And again, same phases of grief, right? Shock,
Hmm.
loss,
Hmm.
anger. And some people stopped at anger and they just got mad at Joe Manchin on the internet and yelled at, got cynical like you were talking about. And some of us, including some members of, a handful of members of the Senate, again said, no, this is not how it's going to end. I
Yeah.
refuse to accept that. So this is also bargaining, right? That's one of the phases of grief. And we went back to work and we bargained, and
Yeah.
we tried to leverage all of the external arguments we could that no, this does not fuel inflation, and it actually legitimately cuts inflation. Larry Summers called him and said that. Bill Gates called him and said, you're losing a huge economic opportunity here, down the line.
Hmm.
And senators looked him in the eye and said, look, Joe, you're killing off our best chance at doing something big before the midterms. Like, we got to do this. What's it going to take? And
Hmm.
it, against all odds, it worked.
Yeah.
I had pretty well given up hope that it was going to succeed at that point, given that this is the second time the rug was pulled out from under us. But again, I wanted to be able to tell my kids that we fought to the very end, right? And until the legislative session was over, or until they passed a reconciliation bill and used up our chance to do the budget this fiscal year without energy in it, we were going to keep pushing, and it worked. And I am so grateful. I'm going to tear up a little for all the people really that did that, because it was very, very close to failure. And so I think what we can take away from that is people can make a difference, right? Individual people, members of the Senate, campaigners, Senate staff, analysts, Larry Summers, can actually make a difference here in the course of
I've
history, right?
always, that's
Pushing
one of the
things.
things I always think about Larry Summers is like, is
Yeah,
he really
you can
making a
make a
difference?
difference. And also that this is definitely the best bill we could have gotten, right? Because we pushed it to the brink and we almost lost.
Yeah.
And this is the best, the best thing we could have done. And so I do think that's important when you think about like your frame of reference to evaluate this bill. Yes, it's not the Green New Deal. Yes,
Yeah.
it's not the Build Back Better Act. I wanted those things very much.
Yeah.
But this bill is huge, and it makes a huge difference, and it is a heck of a lot better than nothing. And I don't say that just to we shouldn't really say that because it makes it sound paltry.
But like,
It is
that's
just
what
great
there
on its own.
was. Nothing was
Yeah,
very,
but we also
very
had
nearly the
almost had
thing.
nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So,
what a saga.
what a saga. And also there's a lot of people when I've been looking through, like, I basically read everything that's in the bill. There are a few things that I do not understand, but there are some things that I do understand that I just like don't see being talked about a lot, like this green bank that like 40%
Yeah.
of the money that is going to be loaned out has to be loaned out to disadvantaged communities, and to sort of like give like there's money for reconnecting communities that have been divided by transportation projects.
Right.
There's money to make areas around ports cleaner, because that's traditionally where disadvantaged communities end up living, and
Exactly.
and those are areas where people have worse qualities of life and also shorter lives because of the pollution caused by those ports.
There's a whole bunch of stuff in here. So we've talked about the industrial policy that's going to drive a lot of manufacturing jobs. I mentioned there's incentives to buy American, but also to invest in energy communities. So places that have traditionally been part of the fossil fuel economy,
Right.
they're going to get
Yeah.
a chunk of this investment.
Hmm.
But there's also $60 billion in programs that help reduce harmful pollution in environmentally disadvantaged communities. The folks that have borne the brunt of our current fossil energy economy and the pollution that results from that, as well as to ensure more equitable access to renewable energy and energy efficiency or building electrification, right? So a lot of those things cost a lot more money up front, but save money,
Right.
and lower middle income folks can't take advantage of that as easily. So there's a whole bunch of things. I tried to detail them in our report, just because we don't model the emissions. We model the emissions
Right.
impact of some of them, but we don't really highlight the pollution reductions and the benefits for local communities. But they're huge. So, if you just look at pollution reduction in low-income communities, there's $3 billion for block grants that are actually going to be led by community groups. So communities propose projects in environmental, climate justice and environmental justice projects. There's $3 billion in federal block grants to implement those. There's $4 billion in funds to reduce air pollution at ports, as you mentioned. There's more to replace dirty, heavy, as well as to replace dirty, heavy-duty vehicles like garbage trucks and city buses that also disproportionately pollute in low-income communities with zero-emissions cars. There's money to improve interior air quality in low-income community schools. There's bills that fund much enhanced air pollution monitoring by the EPA in fence-line communities that are right outside of the heavily polluting areas, so we can keep a closer eye on what polluters are up to. The bill reinstates and starts adjusting for inflation the Superfund tax that funds the Superfund cleanups. So polluters pay into this fund. It has expired and has not been adjusted for inflation since, I don't know when, 1990 something.
Yeah. I live down
and so
the
that's
river
going to help cover.
from the biggest Superfund site in America, and
Yeah.
it is beautiful. The cleanup that they've done is actually like
Yeah,
it's
and it
so
costs a lot of
inspiring.
money.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's going to pay into that. There's $1 billion to improve energy and water efficiency and indoor air quality and climate resiliency in affordable housing projects at federal, affordable housing projects. And then there's this $3 billion transportation access and affordability fund, which is the one you mentioned, that is specifically targeted to communities that have been bisected by or impacted by federal transportation infrastructure like interstate highways in the past, which were, jammed right through low-income communities and communities of color, and really divided those communities for decades. $3 billion is not enough to heal that scar,
Yeah.
but it's going to start, and that's, it's the first to start to tackle that kind of problem. And then there's another bunch of money, including that $27 billion Green Bank Fund or Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that is going to help expand equitable access to clean and efficient technologies for lower income and disadvantaged communities. It deploys over half of that funding specifically to help deploy clean energy and pollution reduction technologies in low income and disadvantaged communities. And then there's hundreds of millions of dollars in grants and $20 billion in loan authority to help tribal and native Hawaiian communities improve their climate resilience and access clean electricity or electrify buildings as well. And then there's 2 rebate programs that complement tax credits that more wealthy folks that have tax liability can take advantage of, that are a total $8.8 billion in grants for state programs that provide low-income and middle-income households with grants and rebates to install energy-efficient whole house retrofits or to electrify their homes that wouldn't otherwise be able to take advantage of the tax credits. So it's a lot in there. Again, would love to see more. I hope we build on that in the future.
Yeah.
But $60 billion, including leveraged funds like that Green Bank that are going to go more, they're going to
Right.
seed green banks that are going to get out 10 times that much money into communities.
Yeah.
These are going to have a big impact. And again, there's just so much in this bill, you lose sight of all the different things in it.
That I think that's part of the reason why I have been so dissatisfied with the coverage of it, is because when you start to try and tell people what's actually in it, you're like, all right, I'm going to need you to sit through an hour-long podcast where we just get the surface level of all of these things.
Yeah.
Because they do go really deep and like it is so thoughtfully done, and there is clearly so much care that has gone into this. And as somebody who looks at how we build space telescopes, I see that level of care where it's like every single piece of this, it's so big and important and it affects so many people that we have to make sure that this point of failure cannot fail. And like it's so big that of course 10 years from now we're going to find some pieces of this legislation that people are going to rag on and be upset about, but we're also going to have for every one of those, there's going to be 10 pieces of this legislation that just like went so smoothly. Nobody ever thought about it. Nobody thinks that they're not even going to, we're not going to know how much this has impacted our lives. That's
Yeah.
kind of the beauty of it.
Yeah, and I'll just give a plug for like anybody who's excited about this and wants to go help make it real. There's a lot of implementation that's going to have to happen over the next decade of
Yeah.
these programs. So,
Yeah.
like, you want to go get on the cutting edge of the clean energy transition, go work for the Department of Energy or the Environmental Protection Agency and help get these programs
Yeah.
working on the ground, or even the IRS, because a lot of this is tax code stuff. So,
Yeah.
let's get the tax code right and make sure these things can actually be used. Yeah, I mean, they're already the Department of Energy got about $60 billion in funding from the infrastructure law to deploy to do clean energy demonstration and deployment programs and rebuild our grid. So they're hiring a clean energy corps of like 1,000 people already. This is just going to add to that. So
Yeah.
there's all kinds of it's like Uncle Sam needs you. There's going to be a lot of opportunities like that if you want to get into it.
That's right. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for your time in the busiest week maybe of your life, but busy for the best of reasons.
Exactly.
I'm really grateful to have been able to have you walk me through this and learn more about it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I appreciate the opportunity.